The halls of Congress recently bore witness to a profound ideological collision that transcends mere political posturing and touches the very marrow of national security doctrine. At the center of this firestorm stood Representative Chrissy Houlahan and Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, two figures whose diverging visions for the Pentagon represent a generational and conceptual schism. This was not merely a debate over personnel statistics or recruitment quotas, but a fundamental inquiry into the evolution of modern lethality. Houlahan, leveraging her background as an Air Force veteran, challenged the traditionalist paradigms that have long dictated the composition of frontline combat units. The air in the hearing room remained thick with tension as she dissected the Secretary's previous assertions regarding the biological and tactical suitability of women in high-intensity conflict zones. Secretary Hegseth's appointment had already signaled a potential pivot toward a more classical interpretation of military readiness and physical prowess. His public discourse has frequently emphasized the primacy of brute force and the visceral realities of close-quarters engagement as the ultimate arbiters of battlefield success. This perspective posits that the introduction of gender integration in infantry and special operations might inadvertently compromise the cohesion and raw physical output of small units. To the traditionalist wing, the warrior archetype is fixed in a historical mold that prioritizes skeletal muscle mass and specific endurance profiles. This worldview suggests that any deviation from these standards, even in the name of progress, risks a dilution of the nation's sharpest edge. Consequently, the stage was set for a confrontation that would test whether these ancient axioms could survive the scrutiny of 21st century warfare. Representative Houlahan initiated her line of questioning with the surgical precision of a commander, dismantling the notion that lethality is a purely muscular phenomenon. She pointedly addressed the shifting landscape of global conflict, where the cockpit of a fifth-generation fighter or the console of a cyber command center serves as the modern vanguard. By highlighting the cognitive and technical demands of advanced weaponry, she forced a reconsideration of what it actually means to kill or be killed in a digital age. Her argument hinged on the fact that a drone operator's efficacy is measured in spatial awareness and emotional regulation rather than bench press maximums. The Congresswoman's rhetoric effectively stripped away the romanticized veneer of bayonet charges to reveal a reality defined by algorithmic superiority and precision targeting. This was a direct assault on the Secretary's core thesis, framing it as an anachronism in an era of hypersonic missiles and electronic warfare. The exchange grew increasingly pointed as Houlahan utilized a series of hypothetical scenarios to corner the Secretary on the definition of a combatant. She demanded clarity on whether the ability to guide a Reaper drone to a high-value target constituted a role that should be barred based on gendered physical standards. Hegseth's responses, often measured yet firm, reflected a deep-seated belief in the sanctity of the ground combat element as a unique masculine domain. This philosophical divide underscores a broader cultural struggle within the Department of Defense regarding the integration of social evolution and tactical necessity. While the Secretary focused on the potential friction caused by integration, Houlahan focused on the catastrophic risk of excluding qualified talent from the pool of national defenders. The dialogue served as a microcosm of the tension between preserving legacy military cultures and adapting to the demands of a complex, multi-domain battlefield. As the debate unfolded, it became clear that the disagreement was not just about gender, but about the very definition of strength in a strategic vacuum. Houlahan argued that by narrowing the definition of a warrior, the military voluntarily blinds itself to a vast reservoir of intellectual and technical capability. She emphasized that national security is a collective endeavor that requires the full participation of the citizenry, regardless of gendered archetypes. The Secretary's reluctance to concede these points was interpreted by critics as a sign of a rigid ideological commitment that might overlook the nuances of modern recruitment crises. In an era where the United States faces unprecedented competition from near-peer adversaries, the luxury of excluding top-tier talent seems increasingly unaffordable. This confrontation highlighted the urgent need for a cohesive national strategy that aligns cultural values with the cold, hard requirements of geopolitical survival. The technicality of Houlahan's argument rested on the undeniable reality that modern platforms often act as equalizers for physical disparities. When a pilot experiences high G-forces in an F-35, the physiological stress is immense, yet it is a stress that women have proven capable of managing through rigorous training. Houlahan pushed the Secretary to acknowledge that the criteria for these roles are based on objective performance metrics rather than subjective perceptions of grit. By doing so, she effectively neutralized the argument that women are inherently less capable of projecting power in the most critical theaters of operation. This shift in focus from the person to the platform illustrates a fundamental change in how the Pentagon must view its human capital. The Secretary's defense of the status quo appeared to many as an attempt to solve future problems with a rearview mirror approach. Such a disconnect between leadership and the technological reality of the force could have long-term implications for the readiness of the American war machine. Beyond the immediate tactical arguments lies a deeper concern regarding the signal this debate sends to the hundreds of thousands of women currently serving in uniform. Houlahan's defense of their role was not just a policy critique but a validation of their sacrifices and professional contributions to date. To suggest that their presence is a liability or a social experiment devalues the decades of integration that have already occurred within the ranks. This part of the discussion tapped into the morale and retention issues that plague a volunteer force struggling to meet its end-strength goals. If the leadership of the military is perceived as being hostile to the advancement of half the population, the recruitment pool will inevitably shrink. This isn't just a matter of social justice. It is a pragmatic concern for the sustainability of the force in a prolonged conflict. The Secretary found himself in the difficult position of defending a traditionalist line without alienating the very people he is tasked with leading. The confrontation also touched upon the concept of unit cohesion, a term often used as a shield against any form of radical organizational change. Hegseth argued that the unique bond formed in all-male units is a critical component of combat effectiveness that cannot be easily replicated. Houlahan countered this by suggesting that true cohesion is built on shared competence and mutual trust in a professional environment, not on shared biology. She pointed out that in many modern units, men and women already serve side by side in high-stress environments without the predicted collapse of discipline. This suggests that the fears of the traditionalists may be based more on hypothetical anxieties than on empirical evidence from the field. The debate forced a public reckoning with whether the military should be a mirror of the society it defends or a sequestered institution with its own set of rules. This question remains at the heart of the ongoing struggle to define the American military identity in the 21st century. Strategic competition with nations like China and Russia demands an agile and intellectually diverse officer corps and enlisted force. Houlahan argued that the complexities of gray zone warfare and hybrid threats require a different kind of warrior scholar, one who may not fit the traditional mold. By focusing excessively on the physical requirements of the infantry, the Secretary might be missing the forest for the trees in terms of overall strategic readiness. The Congresswoman's perspective aligns with a modern view of national power that integrates economic, technological, and humanistic elements. This holistic approach to defense is often at odds with the more visceral, combat-centric focus favored by traditionalists like Hegseth. The clash at the hearing was therefore a battle for the soul of the Pentagon's long-term planning and human resource management. It raised the stakes for upcoming policy decisions that will determine the shape of the military for the next generation. Ultimately, the Houlahan-Hegseth exchange serves as a vivid illustration of a nation at a crossroads regarding its foundational security beliefs. On one side is a call for a return to perceived fundamentals and a skepticism of social engineering within the ranks. On the other side is a demand for a modernized, inclusive meritocracy that reflects the technological and social realities of the contemporary world. Neither side can easily dismiss the other's concerns, as both claim to be acting in the best interest of national defense. However, the intensity of the debate suggests that a middle ground will be difficult to find in a polarized political climate. The resolution of this conflict will likely be found not in the hearing rooms of Washington, but on the training grounds and in the command centers where theory meets practice. For now, the dialogue remains a necessary, albeit painful, part of the evolution of American military power. The debate transitioned into a more granular examination of what defines operational lethality in the context of a modern, multi-domain battlefield. Representative Houlahan challenged the Secretary to look beyond the infantry-centric view that has dominated military doctrine for centuries. She argued that the lethality of a force is no longer solely a function of individual physical power but of integrated system performance. In her view, a soldier's value is increasingly tied to their ability to interface with complex artificial intelligence and autonomous systems. This paradigm shift suggests that the traditional barriers to entry for combat roles may be based on outdated metrics of success. The Secretary, however, remained steadfast in his belief that the ultimate test of a military remains the close-quarters fight. This fundamental disagreement over the nature of future conflict lies at the heart of the current policy divide within the Pentagon. Secretary Hegseth's position is rooted in the conviction that war is, at its core, a brutal and physical human endeavor. He contends that while technology can enhance a warrior's capabilities, it cannot replace the raw aggression and physical stamina required in a ground war. This perspective emphasizes that the stresses of combat are unique and that any compromise in physical standards could lead to catastrophic failure. To the Secretary, the push for gender integration feels like an imposition of civilian social values onto a specialized warrior class. He warns that prioritizing diversity over a narrow definition of physical readiness could erode the combat effectiveness of elite units. This stance reflects a broader concern among traditionalists that the military is being used as a laboratory for social experimentation. For Hegseth, the preservation of the all-male combat unit is a matter of maintaining the highest possible margin of victory. Houlahan countered this by pointing out that the military already utilizes differentiated standards for a wide variety of specialized roles. She questioned why the same logic of specialization could not be applied to expanding the roles of women in combat-adjacent positions. Her argument is that by insisting on a one-size-fits-all physical standard, the military is effectively disqualifying brilliance in favor of brawn. She cited examples of female pilots and intelligence officers who have demonstrated exceptional lethality in high-stakes environments for decades. These individuals have proven that the ability to process information and make split-second decisions is often more decisive than physical size. The Congresswoman's approach seeks to deconstruct the myth that combat is a monolithic experience requiring a single type of body. Instead, she advocates for a meritocratic system that values specific skills tailored to specific mission requirements. The discussion then veered into the critical issue of recruitment and the long-term sustainability of the all-volunteer force. Houlahan noted that the military is currently facing one of its most severe recruiting crises in recent American history. She argued that alienating women through exclusionary rhetoric only serves to exacerbate this problem by cutting off access to talented recruits. If the Department of Defense continues to project an image of being a closed club, it will struggle to attract the next generation. The modern youth cohort values inclusivity and professional environments that reward competence over traditional gender roles. Hegseth's resistance to this cultural shift is seen by some as a strategic liability that could hollow out the force. Without a steady stream of high-quality recruits, the technological advantages of the United States could be rendered moot by a lack of personnel. Moreover, The debate highlighted the evolving role of the human-machine team in maintaining a competitive advantage over global adversaries. Houlahan emphasized that the cognitive load on modern soldiers requires a diverse set of mental perspectives to navigate successfully. She suggested that diverse teams are often better at problem-solving and innovation, both of which are critical in a fast-paced conflict. The Secretary's focus on unit cohesion within all male groups was framed by Houlahan as a limited view of what makes a team effective. She argued that professional cohesion is forged through shared training and the mastery of complex tools rather than biological similarity. This perspective views the military as a high-performance organization that must evolve alongside the technology it employs to stay relevant. The tension between these two views reflects the broader challenge of preparing for a war that looks nothing like the past. Hegseth's skepticism regarding gender integration often points to data concerning injury rates and the long-term physical toll on female service members. He argues that the physiological differences between men and women are an immutable reality that policy cannot simply ignore. From this viewpoint, placing women in certain roles is not just a readiness issue but a matter of protecting their well-being. Houlahan, however, retorted that these risks are known and managed by the individuals who volunteer for such high-risk assignments. She insisted that women should have the agency to decide which risks they are willing to take for their country. By denying them this choice, the military is effectively treating women as second-class citizens within the national security apparatus. This debate over paternalism versus autonomy is a recurring theme in the history of military integration efforts. The Congresswoman also touched upon the strategic necessity of representing the American people in the ranks of those who defend them. She argued that a military that does not reflect the diversity of its nation risks losing the support of the public. This connection between the military and society is vital for the long-term health of a democratic state. Hegseth's traditionalist approach, while popular with certain segments of the population, risks creating a warrior caste that is disconnected from the broader culture. This disconnect could lead to a lack of understanding between the civilian leadership and the military professionals who execute their orders. Houlahan's vision is one of a more integrated and transparent military that is fully embedded in the fabric of modern life. This philosophical difference goes beyond policy and enters the realm of political theory and the role of the state. As the exchange intensified, it became clear that the Secretary's worldview is influenced by a desire to return to a perceived era of military purity. He often speaks of a time when the mission was the only metric that mattered, unencumbered by social or political considerations. Houlahan challenged this nostalgia, arguing that the mission itself has fundamentally changed and expanded in the modern era. The mission now involves cyber defense, information operations, and complex stabilization tasks that require a wide array of human talents. To ignore these changes is to prepare for a war that has already been fought and won, rather than the one on the horizon. The Secretary's reluctance to adapt is seen by his critics as a form of strategic stagnation that could have dire consequences. The hearing served as a wake-up call for those who believe that the military can remain insulated from societal shifts. Furthermore, the impact of this debate extends to the international stage, where allies and adversaries alike are watching American military policy. Houlahan pointed out that many of our closest allies have successfully integrated women into all combat roles without a loss of effectiveness. This global context suggests that the United States might be lagging behind its peers in terms of human resource innovation. On the other hand, traditionalists argue that the United States has unique responsibilities as a global superpower that require a more conservative approach. This tension between international norms and American exceptionalism adds another layer of complexity to the discussion. The Secretary's decisions will ultimately signal to the world what kind of force the United States intends to project in the coming years. Whether that force is seen as a modern, inclusive juggernaut or a relic of the past remains to be seen. In conclusion of this segment, the confrontation between Houlahan and Hegseth represents a clash of two distinct visions for the future of American power. One vision is rooted in the traditions of the past, prioritizing physical strength and a specific type of unit culture. The other is forward-looking, emphasizing technological fluency, cognitive diversity, and the full utilization of the nation's human capital. This debate is far from over, as it touches on the most fundamental questions of identity, security, and the nature of modern warfare. The outcomes of these discussions will shape the Pentagon's policies for decades to come, affecting everything from recruitment to tactical doctrine. As the world becomes increasingly complex, the need for a clear and effective military strategy has never been more urgent. The dialogue in the hearing room was a vital step in determining the path forward for the nation's defense. The focus of the congressional inquiry shifted toward the undeniable reality of autonomous systems and the digital architecture of the modern battlefield. Representative Houlahan emphasized that the evolution of weaponry has fundamentally decoupled physical stature from the ability to project lethal force across vast distances. She pointed to the rise of unmanned aerial vehicles and remote-operated platforms as the new primary instruments of American strategic dominance. In this context, the traditional image of the infantryman is being supplemented, and in some cases replaced, by the technician and the remote operator. These roles demand a high degree of cognitive endurance, technical fluency, and ethical judgment rather than superior upper body strength. Houlahan argued that by maintaining gender-based restrictions, the military is essentially applying a 19th century filter to a 21st century technological landscape. This creates a strategic bottleneck where the best possible operators are excluded based on criteria that have no bearing on their operational success. Secretary Hegseth, however, maintained a cautious stance regarding the total reliance on technological solutions as a replacement for human physical grit. He suggested that technology is often fragile and can be neutralized by an adversary through electronic warfare or kinetic strikes on infrastructure. In a scenario where the digital network fails, the Secretary argues that the mission will always revert to the basic physical capabilities of the soldiers on the ground. From his perspective, the muscle of the military acts as the ultimate failsafe against the unpredictability of high-tech warfare. He expressed concern that overemphasizing technical roles could lead to a softening of the force's core combat identity. This philosophical resistance suggests a fear that the American military might lose its warrior soul if it becomes too preoccupied with screens and joysticks. The tension here is between a vision of warfare as a technical problem to be solved and warfare as a primal test of human will. Houlahan countered this by highlighting that the very definition of the ground has shifted into the domains of space and cyberspace. She argued that a cyber attack on the power grid or a satellite network can be more devastating than a conventional infantry assault. The individuals defending these frontiers do not need to meet the physical standards of a ranger or a SEAL to be effective. She pressed the Secretary to explain how a woman's biological profile would hinder her ability to defend the nation from a sophisticated digital intrusion. The Secretary's response remained focused on the preservation of traditional combat units, seemingly sidestepping the broader implications of Houlahan's technical critique. This avoidance highlighted a potential blind spot in a defense strategy that prioritizes legacy combat roles over emerging threats. The exchange underscored the difficulty of integrating disparate visions of security into a single, cohesive national policy. Furthermore, the discussion delved into the specific requirements of the Air Force and Navy, where Houlahan has significant personal and professional insight. She noted that women have been flying combat missions and commanding warships for decades with exemplary records of success. These environments are characterized by high-stress decision-making and the mastery of multi-billion-dollar weapon systems. In these spheres, The argument for physical exclusion has long been debunked by the reality of female performance in actual combat theaters. Houlahan used these established facts to challenge the Secretary's skepticism regarding the expansion of women's roles in other elite units. She argued that the success of women in the cockpit proves that the limitations cited by traditionalists are often social constructs rather than biological imperatives. If a woman can navigate an F-35 through contested airspace, the argument for her exclusion from other high-stakes roles becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. The Secretary's focus on unit cohesion was also subjected to a rigorous technical and sociological critique by the Congresswoman. She cited studies indicating that diverse teams often exhibit higher levels of collective intelligence and better risk management capabilities. In the high-stakes environment of a command center or a special operations planning cell, these attributes are far more valuable than homogeneity. Hegseth's insistence that integration disrupts the special bond of all male units was framed by Houlahan as an emotional argument rather than a data-driven one. She suggested that professional excellence and shared mission objectives are the true catalysts for unit cohesion in any modern organization. By prioritizing a specific cultural atmosphere over broader operational competence, the military risks becoming less effective in complex environments. This part of the debate forced a public examination of whether the Pentagon values tradition more than empirical performance metrics. As the world enters an era of hyperwar, where speed and information superiority are the primary currencies of power, the human element must adapt. Houlahan argued that the cognitive diversity provided by a fully integrated force is a strategic requirement, not a political luxury. She pointed out that our adversaries are already investing heavily in human capital without the same cultural hang-ups that seem to be stalling American progress. The Secretary's traditionalism, while intended to protect the force, could inadvertently hand a competitive advantage to more pragmatic competitors. The debate highlighted a growing concern that the United States is fighting an internal cultural war while its external enemies are focusing on technological leapfrogging. Houlahan's line of questioning served as a reminder that national security requires a constant state of evolution and self-critique. The Secretary's role, she argued, should be to facilitate this evolution rather than to act as a barrier to it. The impact of artificial intelligence on the battlefield was another key point where the two leaders found little common ground. Houlahan envisioned a future where AI-driven systems require human overseers who are experts in ethics, logic, and systems management. These roles are inherently gender-neutral and require a broad recruitment pool to find the most capable minds in the country. The Secretary, conversely, seemed more concerned with how these technologies would integrate with the existing physical structures of the combat arms. He expressed a desire to ensure the technology serves the warrior, rather than the warrior becoming a mere appendage to the machine. This distinction is subtle but critical, as it shapes how the military invests in training and personnel development. Houlahan's approach is fundamentally more inclusive, seeing technology as a bridge that allows all citizens to contribute their unique talents to the defense of the nation. Houlahan also addressed the issue of equipment and infrastructure, which have historically been designed for a male physiological baseline. She argued that the military's failure to adapt its gear, from body armor to cockpit ergonomics, has created artificial barriers for women. This lack of investment is then used as evidence that women are less capable when, in fact, they are simply being asked to use poorly fitting tools. The Secretary was challenged to commit to a more equitable approach to research and development that accounts for the entire force. This technical point underscored how systemic biases can be embedded in the very hardware of the Department of Defense. By ignoring these practical realities, the leadership reinforces a status quo that is both inefficient and exclusionary. Houlahan's insistence on this point showed her deep understanding of the practical hurdles that female service members face every day. The dialogue concluded this segment with a look at the future of military leadership and the message being sent to the next generation of officers. Houlahan argued that if the path to the highest levels of command is tied to roles that are restricted by gender, the military will never have a truly diverse leadership tier. This creates a glass ceiling that discourages the most ambitious and talented women from pursuing a career in the armed forces. The Secretary's defense of the status quo was seen as a preservation of a legacy system that may no longer be fit for purpose. This debate is about more than just the current workforce. It is about the long-term health and legitimacy of the military as an institution. The Congresswoman made it clear that a modern superpower cannot afford to leave half of its intellectual and strategic talent on the sidelines. The Secretary's responses suggested that the battle over the Pentagon's cultural and operational identity is far from resolved. The confrontation between Representative Houlahan and Secretary Hegseth eventually expanded into the realm of high-level strategic competition and the preservation of global hegemony. Houlahan argued that the United States is currently locked in a desperate struggle for technological and intellectual dominance against near-peer adversaries. In this high-stakes environment, the primary resource is no longer iron or oil, but the specialized human capital capable of managing complex global systems. She posited that a leadership philosophy which seeks to narrow the talent pool based on traditionalist social views is inherently self-defeating. By creating an environment that feels exclusionary to women, the Pentagon effectively cedes a massive portion of its intellectual potential to its rivals. This is not a matter of political correctness, but a cold calculation of national survival in an era where cognitive agility is the ultimate weapon. The Congresswoman emphasized that the security of the nation depends on mobilizing the entire population, not just a demographic slice of it. Secretary Hegseth's counterargument focused on the necessity of maintaining a distinct and uncompromising military culture to deter aggression from abroad. He suggested that the perception of a woke or socially distracted military could embolden adversaries who perceive such shifts as a sign of internal weakness. From his perspective, the primary goal of the Department of Defense is to build a force that is feared for its lethality and single-minded focus on destruction. He argued that the introduction of social engineering into combat units risks diluting this essential image of American strength. To the Secretary, the traditional warrior ethos is a strategic asset in itself, acting as a psychological deterrent against those who would challenge the United States. He remains concerned that by chasing modern social norms, the military might lose the very qualities that make it an effective instrument of national power. This highlights a fundamental tension between projecting strength through tradition versus projecting strength through modern, inclusive efficiency. Houlahan dismantled this view by pointing out that modern deterrence is built on much more than the image of a physical warrior. She argued that our adversaries are most intimidated by our ability to innovate, adapt, and integrate diverse technologies faster than they can. A military that is stuck in a debate about gender roles appears, to the outside world, as an institution struggling with its own identity rather than one focused on the future. She suggested that true strength comes from a meritocracy where the best and brightest are empowered to lead, regardless of their background. If a female strategist or engineer can provide the decisive edge in a simulated conflict with a foreign power, her gender is irrelevant to the outcome. By focusing on the person instead of the performance, the Secretary's approach might inadvertently signal a lack of strategic seriousness to the rest of the world. The debate thus became a question of how the United States defines its comparative advantage in a multipolar world. The discussion also touched on the critical issue of the all-volunteer force and its viability in a prolonged high-intensity conflict. Houlahan warned that the current recruitment shortfalls are a direct threat to national security and that the military must adapt to stay relevant to the labor market. If the Department of Defense is seen as an organization that devalues the contributions of women, It will lose out on the top-tier talent that is also being recruited by the private sector. The Secretary's traditionalist rhetoric, she argued, acts as a barrier to the very people the military needs most to navigate the complexities of modern war. Hegseth remained skeptical, suggesting that the recruitment crisis is actually caused by a departure from traditional military values rather than a lack of inclusivity. This disagreement reflects two diametrically opposed theories on human motivation and institutional loyalty within the American public. The resolution of this debate will determine whether the military can maintain the manpower necessary to meet its global commitments. Furthermore, Houlahan highlighted the importance of the intellectual readiness of the officer corps in making sound strategic decisions during times of crisis. She argued that a leadership team composed of individuals from diverse backgrounds is less likely to fall victim to groupthink or catastrophic blind spots. In the complex environments of modern grey zone warfare, the ability to see a problem from multiple perspectives is a tactical necessity. The Secretary's emphasis on a specific type of unit cohesion was framed by Houlahan as a potential liability if it leads to an insular and rigid decision-making culture. She pressed for a commitment to leadership development that prioritizes mental flexibility and cultural competence as much as physical toughness. This perspective views the military not just as a combat force, but as a vast intellectual enterprise that requires the highest levels of creative problem-solving. The tension between the warrior and the scholar remains a central theme in the evolution of American military leadership. The Secretary's reluctance to affirm the expanded roles of women was interpreted by Houlahan as a sign of a cultural worldview that is out of step with the requirements of modern defense. She argued that a leader's primary responsibility is to remove obstacles to performance, not to create them based on personal or ideological preferences. By refusing to acknowledge the proven track record of women in combat-adjacent roles, the Secretary risks undermining the very meritocracy he claims to protect. Houlahan used her time to demand that the Pentagon's policies be based on rigorous data and empirical evidence, rather than anecdotal concerns about unit culture. This push for data-driven governance is a hallmark of her approach to oversight, seeking to bring a level of professional accountability to the highest levels of the military. The exchange served as a reminder that the Department of Defense is accountable to the people's representatives and must justify its cultural stances with objective results. As the hearing progressed, it became clear that this debate has profound implications for the United States alliances around the globe. Houlahan noted that many NATO allies have moved toward full gender integration and look to the United States for leadership in military modernization. A regression toward more exclusionary policies could create friction within multinational task forces and complicate joint operations. The Secretary, however, argued that the United States must lead by its own standards and prioritize the effectiveness of its own units above international trends. This America-first approach to military culture suggests a willingness to break with established norms if they are perceived to conflict with core combat readiness. Houlahan countered that in a world of integrated security, the ability to work seamlessly with diverse allies is a force multiplier that cannot be ignored. The clash over these differing perspectives reflects a broader debate about the role of American leadership in a changing international order. Houlahan also addressed the psychological impact of the Secretary's words on the current force, particularly on those who do not fit the traditional warrior mold. She argued that a culture of exclusion breeds resentment and erodes the mutual trust that is essential for effective military operations. When a high-ranking official questions the value of a specific group of service members, it sends a ripple effect through the entire chain of command. This can lead to a decline in morale and a toxic environment that drives away the very talent the military is trying to retain. The Secretary was challenged to consider the long-term damage that his rhetoric might be doing to the institutional health of the Pentagon. His defense remained rooted in the idea that the military must be a place of hard truths and uncompromising standards, even if those truths are uncomfortable. This debate over the balance between institutional rigor and individual belonging is at the heart of the modern military experience. The dialogue concluded this segment with a focus on the concept of national resilience and the role of the military in fostering it. Houlahan argued that a truly resilient nation is one where every citizen feels they have a stake and a role in the defense of their country. An inclusive military serves as a powerful symbol of this national unity and shared purpose. The Secretary's vision, by contrast, was portrayed as one that risks balkanizing the population and alienating those who do not see themselves reflected in the warrior archetype. This social dimension of national security is often overlooked, yet it is critical for maintaining public support for military expenditures and interventions. The Congresswoman made a compelling case that a modern superpower must be as strong in its social fabric as it is in its physical armor. The Secretary's responses suggested a more narrow focus on the immediate tactical requirements of the force, leaving the broader social implications to others. The intensity of this exchange highlights the fact that the Pentagon is currently a primary battlefield in the American culture war. The decisions made by leaders like Houlahan and Hegseth will have repercussions far beyond the walls of the hearing room. They will shape the lives of millions of service members and determine the effectiveness of the American military for decades to come. As the nation faces an increasingly uncertain future, the need for a cohesive and forward-looking defense policy has never been more vital. The clash between these two leaders serves as a necessary, if difficult, part of the democratic process of defining that policy. Whether the military will embrace a future of inclusive innovation or return to its traditionalist roots remains the central question of this era. The dialogue continues to push both sides to refine their arguments and confront the realities of a changing world. The final movement of this intellectual confrontation brings us to the ultimate synthesis of power, identity, and the survival of the democratic experiment. Representative Houlahan and Secretary Hegseth represent two divergent paths for the American military, each with its own set of risks and rewards. The debate underscored that the Pentagon is no longer just a Department of War, but a central pillar of national resilience and social cohesion. Houlahan's vision posits that the strength of the Republic is directly proportional to its ability to modernize its most conservative institutions. She argues that the military must lead the way in demonstrating that meritocracy and inclusivity are not mutually exclusive, but rather mutually reinforcing. By failing to integrate the full spectrum of American talent, the nation risks entering a period of strategic atrophy that could be exploited by its rivals. This final argument frames the inclusion of women not as a social victory, but as a mandatory evolutionary step for a global superpower. Secretary Hegseth's closing position remains a staunch defense of the military as a specialized, even separate, domain of human endeavor. He argues that the unique nature of combat requires a culture that is intentionally shielded from the shifting winds of civilian social trends. From this perspective, the warrior class must maintain its ancient foundations to remain an effective deterrent in a world that is still governed by physical force. He warns that a military that tries to be everything to everyone will eventually excel at nothing, losing its lethal edge in the process. The Secretary believes that the preservation of traditional combat norms is the only way to guarantee the security of the American people in the face of absolute threats. This philosophy places the burden of proof on the reformers, demanding evidence that change will not compromise the primary mission of winning wars. It is a worldview that prioritizes the continuity of the past over the uncertainties of an integrated future. The resolution of this ideological rift will likely define the operational readiness of the United States for the next half-century. Houlahan has made it clear that the technological and tactical requirements of the 2020s and beyond do not support a return to the exclusionary practices of the 1950s. She insists that the military must be a reflection of the society it defends to maintain its moral and political legitimacy. If the leadership of the defense establishment continues to harbor skepticism toward half its population, it creates a crisis of trust that is difficult to repair. The Secretary's task is to find a way to honor the traditions he values without alienating the modern workforce he requires to function. This delicate balance is perhaps the greatest challenge facing the current administration as it navigates a world of increasing complexity. The dialogue in Congress served as a necessary catalyst for this long-overdue national conversation on the identity of the American soldier. As the global strategic environment becomes more volatile, the luxury of internal cultural division becomes a liability that the nation can ill afford. Houlahan's push for a broader definition of lethality reflects the reality that modern wars are won through information, technology, and diverse strategic thinking. The Secretary's focus on the visceral physical reality of the ground fight serves as a reminder that the cost of failure in war is always paid in human lives. Both leaders claim the mantle of national defense, yet they offer starkly different blueprints for how to achieve it. The outcome of this debate will be written in the recruitment numbers, the innovation cycles, and ultimately, the performance of the force in future conflicts. The hearing was not the end of the discussion, but a high-stakes opening chapter in a new era of military transformation. For the men and women currently in uniform, the stakes could not be higher as their leaders navigate these turbulent ideological waters. In conclusion, the exchange between Houlahan and Hegseth highlights a fundamental truth about the American military. It is an institution in a constant state of becoming. The tension between tradition and progress is the engine that has historically driven its evolution from a colonial militia to a global hegemon. While the disagreement is sharp and the rhetoric often heated, it is a sign of a healthy democracy that such fundamental questions are debated in the open. The challenge now is to move beyond the polarized talking points and build a force that is both culturally resilient and technologically superior. Whether that force will be more inclusive or more traditional remains a point of intense national interest. Ultimately, the survival of the nation's defense apparatus depends on its ability to integrate the best of its history with the requirements of its future. The path forward must be paved with a clear-eyed assessment of what it truly takes to project power and protect freedom in a rapidly changing world.